5, 4, 3. All right, good evening. You are live.
Great, thanks, Nick. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the December 10th, 2024 Zoning Committee meeting. We will be holding the hybrid public meeting, which enables remote electronic participation as legally authorized by the Code of Virginia and Planning Commission electronic meeting policy adopted on July 7th, 2022. Members of the ZOCO participating both here in person or virtually through electronic means. At this time, I'd like to orient everyone to our hybrid environment and cover a few specifics about tonight's meeting. Members of the public may attend the meeting here and in person. We don't have any members of the public.
2 members of the public and who are attending virtually.
Okay, thank you. Microsoft Teams link provided on the ZOCO webpage. The county's event calendar and email notification sent to ZOCO email subscribers. Additionally, there's a dial-in option for those who are virtual using Microsoft Teams. Please turn off your video feed and keep your microphones muted as you enter the meeting and during the meeting. The Microsoft Teams meeting chat will only be used to provide instructions for virtual attendees on how to register for public comments and to field general questions about Microsoft Teams. The Teams chat will not otherwise be monitored by staff or the planning commissions during the meeting, nor will it be used to collect feedback. Unlike planning commission's regular meetings, ZOCO agenda items are not public hearings. Therefore, public comment is at the ZOCO chair's discretion after the committee discussion has concluded. Public comments associated with the agenda items can be provided by people attending in person and virtually. For in-person attendees, indicate on the meeting sign-in sheet that you would like to provide public comment. For virtual attendees, indicate in the Teams chat that you would like to provide public comment, and your name will be added to the list of speakers. Anybody wishing to speak tonight definitely will have 2 minutes to do so. As a reminder, you can always provide written comments via the link that is provided in the Teams chat and in the ZOCO website. All written comments will be shared with the Planning Commission and posted to the ZOCO page for public viewing. All comments received as of noon today have already been shared with ZOCO. I will call for speakers at the end of the meeting, and I will ask Mr. Rogers to let me know if we have any virtual attendees who would like to provide a comment. Mr. Rogers will acknowledge speakers in the team chat. Members of the public attending virtually will speak first, followed by in-person attendees. When virtual attendees are called upon to speak, you must unmute yourself by clicking on the microphone icon that is located on the meeting command bar. The moderator does not have the ability to unmute you. Lastly, this is a public forum. Today's meeting will be recorded and posted to the county website. All information associated with today's meeting, whether written or spoken, is subject to the Freedom of Information Act requirement. Great. With that, we will move into quick round of introductions, although I think everybody is pretty familiar with each other. I am Leo Sarley of the Planning Commission, and I'll go with counterclockwise.
Peter Robertson, Planning Commission.
Jim Antelme, Planning Commission.
Nick Rogers, County Staff, Planning Division.
And folks with us online that are staff or Planning Commission.
Olivia Sontag with the CPHD.
Matt Matuzak, also with the Planning Division.
Thank you.
And Tony Striner, I'm here with the Planning Commission.
Sorry. Tony, sorry I interrupted you.
Oh, I'm Tony Striner, I'm here with the Planning Commission.
Thank you. Is that it?
That's it amongst staff and planning commissioners.
All right, your turn.
And Eric Berkey.
All right. With that done, I will turn it over to Ms. Sontag, I believe, who will do the presentation for the one item on our agenda tonight.
Thank you. I'll go ahead and share my screen. And it looks like we have Mr. Gibson, who's joined us from the Department of Environmental Services. So he'll be available to answer questions as well. And apologies that we were not able to attend in person this evening, but we do have a pretty thorough presentation prepared, and hopefully it'll leave very few questions at the end. So to get us started, we are going to cover some of the background and site context, the MFDP implementation, and then we'll focus on the areas of change in the neighborhoods form-based code and some minor changes in the commercial form-based code. So to start with some of the background and site context, we know that you've probably heard some of this in different capacities at the Planning Commission and LRPC and the Form-Based Code Advisory Working Group, but understanding that some people are probably still catching up or need a refresher, we have a few slides just to help orient everybody. So this is the Barcroft site here on the right-hand side of the page. Denotes all of the different buildings that are currently within the boundaries of what we're calling the Barcroft property. It's approximately 62 acres. It was developed in 2 different phases, a total of 8 different sections denoted by these different colors, and contains a total of 13 and 35 units. So some additional background, the site was listed for sale in 2021. It risks the displacement of current residents. So together with a loan from Arlington County and Amazon, we successfully purchased the property in late 2021. And as a result, all 1335 units were preserved for 99 years, up to 60% AMI. So as a result, none of the residents were displaced, rents were frozen, and annual increases were capped at 3% up to a maximum of 60% AMI. Over here on the side, you'll see an example of the Master Financing Development Plan that was initially submitted back in October of 2022. In just a minute, we'll kind of highlight some of the changes that have been made to that document in recent months. So to touch briefly on some of the renovation use permits that the Planning Commission has seen over the past year, this map on the side shows the green areas, which show the first 4 renovation use permits that have been approved. And then the red areas are renovation use permits that are forthcoming in the first half of 2025. So the Jar Lynch team has continued to have use permits reviewed to advance some of the interior renovations that will occur across the site. These interior renovations are going to deliver in-unit washers and dryers, lots of updates to kitchens and bathrooms, mechanical systems, roofs, outdoor amenity areas, deliver some Type A accessible units and ADA parking where feasible, and overall improved vegetation and tree canopy, as well as green building certifications. So this is a breakdown of the work that has been occurring this past year. In the first half of 2024, our goal was to verify and update the overall vision for Barcroft. So we worked closely with an expanded Form-Based Code Advisory Working Group, which included representatives from various commissions across the county and community organizations. We engaged both with those groups and with residents in the broader community to get input on the updates to this vision. And most of this engagement was focused on between February and May of this year, with the RTA in June and county board approval of several items in July, which I'll touch on in just a minute. So with this updated vision, the second half of 2024 is just focused on the technical implementation of some of these changes to the vision. So it's primarily working with, at this point, the Form-Based Code Advisory Working Group and the Zoning Committee. The other big consideration is considering merging all of the Barcroft properties in the neighborhoods Form-Based Code for clarity. Some of those currently exist in the commercial code. And then we're also looking at getting this work completed so we can begin reviewing new construction applications for redevelopment. So again, this is just a snapshot of the different groups that were involved in this expanded Form-Based Code Advisory Working Group, which helped inform the vision process the first half of the year, and also helped to review the proposed Form-Based Code amendments during the second half of the year. So a core membership of the Form-Based Code Advisory Working Group. Here are some of the key commissions and committees, different community representatives, as well as a host of a number of different staff specialties. So in July of this year, the board did consider 3 different items. The first was the updates to the visioning documents for Columbia Pike, which are the Columbia Pike Initiative and the Neighborhoods Area Plan. So they did adopt those vision updates, which Matt will touch on just a little bit more in a bit. And then also advertised updates to 2 of the comprehensive plan elements, both the general land use plan map and the master transportation plan map. And then the third item was seeking approval of the master financing development plan, which the county board did approve in July. In the background, we've continued to review the renovation use permits, and we are currently in the process of reviewing the first development use permit. So now that we have the updated vision, we are looking to implement that updated vision in both of the codes. This updates a number of different elements, including land uses, building heights, the street alignments and cross sections, the orientation and location of public spaces, and then the limits of preservation areas and some associated development regulation updates. So since the MFDP was adopted in July 2024, we did want to highlight 2 specific changes that have occurred. The first is the Resident Amenity Center, which is shown here in the center, was previously going to remove an existing building in that location to make way for the new amenity center. It no longer will be located here, and that building will now be preserved. This does help to the Jar Lynch's pursuit of tax credits on the property. They do need to preserve all of these core buildings in order to get access to those tax credits. So this amenity center will now shift to one of the nearby new construction buildings, possibly adjacent to a future public park, but that location is still yet to be determined. And then the public park that was planned at the intersection of 12th Road and Taylor Street is actually going to shift just slightly west, kind of swapping places with this building just adjacent to it. And this is to improve the feasibility of new construction for this particular development pad. But as you can see, the proposed public parks here on the corner of Columbia Pike and George Mason, here near 12th Street, and over closer to Wakefield are all still well distributed throughout the site. So the changes that we've identified fall into 3 general categories. The first is updates to the regulating plan maps, which denote the buildable areas, public spaces, permitted uses, and building heights generally. The second bucket is the street cross-section diagrams and the street typologies. So this will show the location of new streets and the cross-sections that are envisioned. And then the third item is regulatory text to correct some of the, to accommodate some of the envisioned development for the Barcroft site. So this is a snapshot of the schedule that we've been going through the second half of 2024. We did see the first new construction application submitted in September. The form-based code advisory working group with the expanded working group then reviewed the amendments twice, once in October and once in November. We're now here with the ZOCO, and then tomorrow evening, the Form-Based Code Advisory Working Group will review the first new construction application. We anticipate taking these amendments to the county board for the request to advertise in January, and then taking all 3 of these options all 3 of these actions, including the amendments to the GLEP and the MTP, the amendments to both of the form-based codes, and the first new construction use permit to commissions and the county board in February. And lastly, this is a summary of the text changes that were included in the ZOCO memo, and I'll just provide an overview of these, and then we're happy to answer questions after the presentation. So The first section that needs updating is in section 1, and it updates the applicability section and adds the C2 zoning district to include commercially zoned properties that were previously governed by the commercial form-based code. These were not originally listed in the neighborhood's form-based code, and now that we're proposing to consolidate all of the Barcroft properties into the neighborhood's form-based code, adding this zoning district was necessary. And then in section 2, it's our administration section. There are 2 different areas that need updates. The first is to add an exclusion clause for the conservation areas to the existing restriction that's placed on projects when they request modifications. This clause states that no additional density proposed beyond the number of units legally existing in buildings at the time of application you can't increase density, and we're proposing to add a clause that would allow additional density if the developer proposes new accessible units or family-sized units, which is 2-bedroom or greater. This was a concern that was brought up during the review of the renovation use permits. So we've added this clause to allow for accessible units or family-sized units if they want to propose additional density. And then the second update to the administration section is to require an online engagement as an additional step when we're reviewing public plazas or mini parks. And then in section 4, it's our building envelope standards. We are introducing, there's kind of 2 parts to this one, some limited exceptions for encroaching into the parking setback lines when you're on block corners. And then the second piece of this is an exception for loading areas for sites whose required build-to line is not located on a principal arterial. So this would only be allowed if it's on side streets or non-arterial streets. And then for section 5, there's 1 update here. This is to clarify expectations for the streetscape environment when it's adjacent to public parks. This is primarily to address the setback requirement between the park location and the building location. Currently, the form-based code prescribes a setback when there are residential units on the ground floor. And this would clarify some smaller setbacks if commercial uses are proposed. So we wouldn't have as large of dooryards and the privacy needs if it's commercial versus it being residential. And then in section 7, we're introducing some exemptions to some of the building wall and material requirements. So this would clarify that exemptions can be considered for the facade for Virginia housing requirements when waivers aren't granted from Virginia housing. And this includes elements like cladding, new openings in the primary facade for things like ventilation, windows, and then entry canopies. And then the last change is to the natural preserve area definition in section 10, and this is to add the terms microforests and meadows as allowable treatments in these areas. And with that, I'm going to pass it off to Mr. Matuzik for the remainder of the presentation.
Thank you, Ms. Sontag. Good evening, everybody. What I wanted to focus on in this next section is really what occupied the bulk of our time this year through a lot of different conversations between county staff, the property owner, and really feedback from the community that allowed us to figure out a lot of the different moving pieces on Barcroft. And a lot of it started with what's going to happen in the streetscape environment, particularly given that much of the property will remain the same. However, its edges, both east, west, and north, will redevelop. And one of the things that we discovered was initially we wanted to get a better understanding of the street network overall. And this is where the first half of the year tried to focus on. ensure our consistency with the master transportation plan, and really use the first half of the year to emphasize the need for this property to contribute to the bicycle network that was previously planned for this portion of Columbia Pike. As that was happening behind the scenes, we were taking some initial assessments of the specifics of how do you implement and execute on delivering this network, both from a vehicular and a bicycle perspective. So with that in mind, and as well as considering all of the ongoing county initiatives to improve multimodal connectivity around the perimeter of the property, we landed at a pretty good consensus on what needs to happen on Barcroft. But it is complicated, so we just wanted to carefully walk you through why you're seeing as much as what you're seeing. So on the next slide, you can see how the form-based code already has about 4 typical cross sections. The Columbia Pike one is not included on the slide, but the 3 predominant ones that appear on every other site are. We initially, I think, evaluated whether or not those could be appropriate for Barcroft. However, for the reasons listed on the slide, we were unable to utilize them given the complexities and unique elements that are at play here, and therefore had to move on very early in this year's process to identify new cross sections that we believe could achieve the vision while still enable the redevelopment and preservation to occur. So this is kind of a explanation of why you're going to see a lot more new cross sections, and not simply us relying on the ones that are currently in the form-based code. On the next slide, we also wanted to reiterate a point that continued to come up in the last couple of months, but a factor that really informed much of our initial assessment, which was getting ahead of comments that we may anticipate from the fire marshal, as they are required to evaluate all future applications here and elsewhere in the county. And with that in mind, we wanted to make sure that as we gain more information about how the site could redevelop and be preserved, that fire access was front and center and wasn't going to cause potential issues, design challenges, or conflicts in our review moving forward, particularly given that the future of the site is going to require several years, if not potentially decades, to ultimately realize its vision. So this reference was quite helpful, as many people, I think, had questions about what's driving this. And what the reference really addresses is the ability for the fire trucks, particularly for buildings that are over 35 feet, many of which on Barcroft will be, to properly be able to park adjacent to those new buildings, but also not be too far away from them to properly service them if there's a fire. So the 26-foot minimum that needs to be maintained in the roadway, plus the 30-foot maximum that is measured from that edge to the edge of the building, significantly informed the cross sections that are found later in this presentation and also in the memo that was posted online. On the next slide, this kind of gives you a sense of that planned network that we've identified in July and how many new cross sections we believe are going to be needed to deliver the vision that we've set for Barcroft. So what you'll see here are 3 new cross sections for the internal roadway network, and then 4 for the perimeter roadways, as shown on the slide. And we're going to go through some of these, but the specifics and individual ones we can certainly bring up during the discussion. So here's another way of summarizing what those look like, both the internal and the perimeter streets. This is a healthy comparison. As you can see, the clear sidewalk differences and how we are emphasizing the accessibility and circulation along Barcroft's perimeter, but also the different nuances in the way bike lanes are being delivered across the property and some of the other zones that you typically would find when form-based code redevelopment occurs. So this is a helpful kind of crosswalk across what you're seeing and how the different cross sections compare. One of the things that on the next slide is also worth mentioning is that within that, the delivery and implementation of the bike network is really important, given all those constraints that we talked about on Barcroft. And for that reason, we've been able to identify 3 distinct categories of how the bike network could be accommodated on this property over time in the space that we have available, and really considering some of the pinch points that the existing buildings are creating for us, that for a number of reasons we need to continue to stay in place and for us to work around. So with that in mind, and also meeting a lot of the other priorities set aside for Barcroft, this combination of design choices was really, I think, the best option to deliver that bike network connectivity throughout property. The next slide shows how that initial recommendation was informed by feedback we collected from the Form-Based Code Advisory Working Group. One of the meetings that we've had earlier this fall, there was strong preference to see if segments of 12th Street that are located on the western half of the property and the Wakefield Street could potentially achieve some of the protected bike lanes that we were calling for on the eastern side of the property. Again, part of what this is identifying is further study and assessments, particularly working with the applicant once applications come in. But the pinch points are going to remain. So it's not something we are ready to commit to, but I think through further study, as you'll see on the next slide, we could reach a condition on some of those segments where potentially that protected bike lane could be delivered. But it's something that is going to require further study, and we'll keep our minds open as we continue to work through this. But beyond that, I think the Form-Based Code Group really was supportive of many of the changes that you're going to see in this presentation. And I think it understands that there's a lot of consistency in what we're calling for here compared to what we've identified in July when the vision was first updated. As we identified and landed on the specific cross sections, 7 in total, what this exercise in the second half of the year required us to do is to go back and make sure that the distribution of these cross sections was also updated in the form-based code, because we do actually have specific maps that tell property owners and developers exactly what cross section is required for every single site and every single street segment. So that information was outdated as of July once we have updated the vision. And through this effort, we have gone in and make sure that those 3 typical cross sections will no longer apply within the limits of Barcroft, but still continue to be guiding factors in the surrounding community. But on the next slide, you'll see how this exhibit that's in the form-based code will have additional colors now that represent those new cross sections, both for the internal and the perimeter roadways. So this has to be one of those things that gets updated in the form-based code if and when we are updating the cross sections themselves. The next segment of slides takes us to that third category that Olivia mentioned, and these are really what spells out the development potential and preservation guidance for many of the property owners and portions of Barcroft here. Now that we've established what the cross section is, at the limits of which we have building lines to which development has to abide by, now it's time to spell out what the developable areas look like and how tall they can be, what use they can have. And much of this has been spelled out in July when we updated the heights of the property and verified what the appropriate land uses are, as the site kind of carries a combination of residential projects, but also residential projects with mixed use on the ground floor. So this example is of the previous or current regulating plan in the form-based code. On the next slide, you can see how that same map with the updated guidance indicates both the revised boundaries in the yellow of those preserved areas, kind of the center and central spine of Barcroft Apartments. But actually, we're looking at the existing regulating plan. This is the updated one. So this gives you a sense of how the preservation areas have been updated. And in the redevelopment areas, we've clarified the new block structure informed by those cross sections and where the various height limits start and end consistent with the existing legend. So this is a critical piece to kind of capture a lot of the work that went into this year in the land use analysis, really kind of pulling everything together, the location of public parks, the preserved areas, new street locations, and any kind of additional special notes that will be needed for further review as applications come in. So that takes us through all the changes that will impact the neighborhood's form-based code. But part of the cleanup, if you will, the administrative elements that need to occur here is some additional cleanup on the commercial form-based code, because up until now, the northwest and the northeast edges of the property were regulated by the commercial form-based code. What we've done in July is to indicate that that guidance really should belong in the neighborhood's form-based code, so that all of Barcroft could be utilized by the same document. So if you look at those past planning guidance documents for Barcroft and its edges, many of which reference the Columbia Pike Initiative from the early 2000s, and are also tracked on the general land use plan map, when we indicate that earlier note 8 district compared to the newer 24 district, which is the neighborhoods code. We've already advertised changes to the GLUP to reflect this change. And on the next two slides, you can see how kind of the before and after image, where on the left is the current commercial code, still incorporating that guidance for the Penske site on George Mason and Columbia Pike. And on the right, you can see how we've now incorporated that into the neighborhoods code, and therefore the commercial code needs to be trimmed back as it no longer provides that guidance. So that's the northeast intersection. If you look at the northwest, where we have the Goodwill site, similarly, the existing condition on the left, and then on the right, once that area has been moved into the neighborhoods code, the commercial code is reduced accordingly. And I believe that should wrap things up. We'll just end it with next steps, where we are anticipating a request to advertise in January and final consideration with public hearings in February of next year. So I'll stop there and hand things back.
Thank you, Ms. Sontag, Mr. Matuzik, for the presentation and the sort of historic background for us to start this conversation. I guess now it's with us, the conversation. So I don't have any particular topics. I can suggest a few if you're interested, but I thought, first of all, if there was any questions or any clarifications that we needed to get from staff, now's the time.
Yeah, I have actually one, and you may have already said this, and I went right past me. The changes we're making to the neighborhood form-based code that covers Barcroft, would they also be applicable to any other parts of Columbia Pike that are under the neighborhood code? And if not, would those property owners say, hey, how about us? Why can't we take advantage of these type of changes?
So there are some text changes that will apply across the entire neighborhood's form-based code, but the changes to the regulating plan and the cross sections will only apply to the Barcroft Apartments property.
And part of the reason for that, I guess, which is, I think, the beginning of your question, is that the updates to the block structure, the increased heights and evolution of permitted uses, that really was the subject of the first half of the year, where we've had a robust public engagement and really direction from the board to revisit that guidance in light of the significant affordable housing commitments that were made in the last 2 years on the property. So I think that scope and guidance was fairly limited to the unique circumstances on Barcroft. And I would imagine in the future, if a similar property faced similar circumstances, although that's hard to believe, we may receive similar guidance to revisit, that vision.
Okay, thank you.
Anyone else?
I expressed this concern, a similar concern to what Commissioner Lantelmi mentioned, where this tool could be used sort of not as intended. So I think as long as you guys feel comfortable with it, and that has been noted, I'm glad to hear it. One concern that I had was the idea of the form-based code and the commercial form-based code versus the neighborhood form-based code, and how that's supposed to be a little bit of a pairing along the main avenue. Do you think there is going to be any impact, negative or otherwise, to that sort of urban intent from the original form-based code, or is that something that we don't need to worry about? And if so, why not? Anyone?
I can jump in on this one to get it started. What we've tried to be mindful of is that the northwest and northeast corners of the property were intentionally codified and lived, where their guidance was located in the commercial code because of the intersections that they were at, and the focus and intent previously, historically, if we go back 30 years, has been to continue to move in a direction where we kind of concentrate commercial activity and activity centers that George Mason and Fulmar run, to varying degrees of density. But I think that information and intent and even history, I think, was still implemented through the changes that we see, whether that's the cross section that's anticipated along Columbia Pike, the urban mixed use frontage, which accommodates commercial activity on the ground floor, some of the accompanying fenestration requirements that come with that, and then the greater heights that are focused along the edges of Barcroft, but less and less towards the interior. So I think we've reached some level of consistency, understanding that not every project will be solely residential. And I think allowing the market to dictate exactly what the character looks like when they come in.
Thanks.
I have one quick thing. And I appreciate the discussion of the cross sections. Don't worry about it. I'm not going to get too deep into that again, but I do I do want to confirm, obviously, at the November North Form-Based Code Advisory Group meeting, you guys, when we talked about cross section, I think it's 1, right? There was an alternative, but obviously, it's not final design. We got to see what happens, so on and so forth, as far as we, getting into the design of that street. So we presented an alternative that would provide a 5-foot bike lane in either direction, as opposed to the unprotected bike lane, which is the original proposal. And obviously, the original proposal is the cross section that's here in the memo on page, what is that? Page 27. So is that just because that's the original proposal and basically we can't make any promises about an alternative design at this point?
Perhaps Mr. Gibson might best be able to answer that one.
Okay.
Let's see if I can get my camera to work correctly.
Hey, Rob.
Here we go.
Yep.
Good evening, everyone. So, I'll have to take a look, but I think that we had talked about it as establishing the same building to building face area, the same sidewalks and streetscape areas, and then there would be flexibility within that curb to curb space that included the bike lanes and the travel lanes and parking, to address the pinch points and also optimize our all ages, all accessible bike facility network. So I think that they're really to be presented side by side with future work to figure out what works best from connectivity, safety, and pinch points with the use permit applications.
Yeah. I'll make a comment, and I'm gonna affirmatively maybe even ask staff not to respond to this. I'm just making a comment, so you all don't. You can turn your cameras off too if you want. But I think it was helpful in the presentation, right? That staff indicated that a reason, when we were talking about the layout and the width of these streets, essentially, a decision has been made, very understandably so, to not push against the interpretation of the requirements of the fire marshal. And those requirements, although they're implementing state code, the part of state code that references the width is an optional part of the state fire safety code. Arlington can change that at any time. Also, the county manager at any time could, direct the fire department to engage, with planning staff to evaluate the necessity of such a strict interpretation here. I'm not saying this to say we should demand a design change. I actually think this is in a really good spot. I'm just pointing out of like, we're leaving so much on the table from like a connectivity and accessibility standpoint because we have a mindset where we won't push up against something where literally a foot could make the difference in getting a bike facility versus unprotected bike facilities, which I'm going to go on a limb and say, I don't know many folks think those are successful strategies for bike facilities. I think we've all seen the issues, which is why they're not recommended. So I'm just pointing that for us, and I'm not asking staff to respond. That's a frustration that I have, and obviously that's at the highest levels of county government to take such an approach. So I'll just leave my comment there.
You know, I totally agree. And it strikes me that, well, fire safety is very, very important. The upgrades of all of these buildings will make them more fire resistant, presumably, number one. And number two, a protected bike lane is way safer than one that isn't. So you're balancing safety on fire safety and road safety. Life is a life, and it's a lot safer for people to bicycle in a protected bicycle lane. I think that is sort of argues that the marginal greater risk, if there is any, to fire safety, is more, you know, is simply the proper bike, the protected bike lane. I think definitely is the way to go.
Yeah, and I think like to add to that, I think if we're going to be serious about talking about like attainability of housing, you know, there's already the single staircase legislation that, you know, Delegate McClure got through for a study last year, and I presume she'll probably push for the actual legislation here this year, next year. And so there are things that are going to bump up against some of these kind of long-standing interpretations that I think if we're going to be serious about housing attainability, like we can't leave so much on the table if we're literally talking about small tweaks. So maybe a discussion for a later time for the planning commission, but something to I think keep in mind as we see other things come through the pipeline. You know, we're just in a situation where our planning staff is not currently empowered to give us maybe, you know, planning staff or other folks to give us the best version of maybe what they could and kind of working through this, right? They have to choose a path that may be suboptimal because they also have to get this through in a certain amount of time, right? And they understand the practicalities of getting things done. So anyway, I don't want to belabor that point, but
No,
so
I
we
think
talked about it.
No, I think it's
Yeah.
good, and it's one that I won't add to, but I will associate myself with this conversation. I think it's a very important one, and one that I think we ought to try to think of ways to elevate it. I agree. So, having said that, let's move on. If there are any other comments or thoughts that we need to hear. I had a few questions that I wanted to touch base on to drill down. So I thought we had some high level conversations. Maybe we can drill down a little bit more to the detail. Although the street sections are pretty detailed. I was wondering if you had a diagram or if you could elaborate a little bit on this. I think it was item number 3, section 4, that talks about that parking 15% and how that setback would work. Just to make sure I understand that correctly, I'm not clear that I totally can envision that. Can you just give us a quick little, first of all, would you happen to have any diagrams or any quick corner that you can illustrate so that we can visually see it, and or, you know, do a quick verbal explanation or illustration of what something like that might mean? Similar
to be clear, you're looking at the parking setback line and the 15% flexibility.
Correct.
I mean, if
I
we
can
can
pull up the proposed central sub-area regulating plan, and we can use that as a starting point.
Thank you.
And this would be an example of one that I think benefits Barcroft, but other sites I think would also benefit from some of the lessons learned here, and perhaps a more standing, long-term standing requirement that we've had in the code that perhaps we are using this opportunity to revisit. But on every site, once we accommodate the cross-section, there's a red line that establishes the edge of the building, the required build-to line, or RBL, as some call it. 30 feet back of that into the property is a blue line that runs parallel to that line, and that is the parking setback line. And what that does is essentially signal that on the ground floor, we still anticipate a certain use, whether it's residential or retail, depending on what you're codified as, to be fronting the public sidewalk behind the streetscape environment. And that activation of the site is really critical to the form-based code success. We recognize and acknowledge that parking generally occupies the ground floor for portions of the site. You require loading, you require parking garage entrance. There's a lot of shared parking accommodations, but we want those to be intentionally set back into the property internal to the building. So there's been a very stringent expectation that at any point you are not able to encroach forward of that parking setback line under any circumstances. And I think what we are willing to consider, and this is partly stemming from a door perhaps that was slightly open in one of our administrative regulations, where during the course of construction, if perhaps an edge of the parking structure exceeds that parking setback line, we are willing to accommodate it to a certain point. We realize things happen on the field. At some point when inspections happen and this gets discovered, we have to be reasonable. And I think building off of that, we felt that it was appropriate to be a little bit more forthcoming about when we introduced that flexibility, and that during the earlier design stages and review by staff, we had some leverage to allow up to 15% of that block face, I believe it is, that could surpass the parking setback line for only like 6 feet, I think it is. And that for us was a reasonable compromise that still ensured the vision is maintained, that for the most part, parking is still tucked into the property. But on some sites, it may have an opportunity to encroach.
Perfect, thank you. And then if we could have a similar little just clarification on the next item, I think it was number 4, section 5, that talks about the park setback and the sidewalk in the front of the door, if I recall correctly.
I think that's everyone's favorite, or maybe just staff.
Great tell.
Yeah, one day we'll develop a thesaurus and a translation device for the form-based code. So it makes perfect sense to everybody, including staff. One of the things that, trying to think of a good example, that might already be on the screen here. But a number of parks are codified throughout the Columbia Pike corridor, many of which are essentially adjacent to a building edge. And you kind of have this transition from the building to the park, and ultimately there's a street. And so the park is tucked away between, or located between, the street and the building itself. And the code wanted to clarify what that relationship is, particularly when the park butts up to the building, but also, and this is where this long clause comes into play, address a few other instances where that transition looks a little bit different, in that we have several kind of median parks, if you will, where they are literally located in the middle of what will be future streets that don't exist today. And in those circumstances, we also wanted to be very clear about what the expectation is for public sidewalks, particularly when buildings are now located on either side of that street, but the park is in the middle. So through zoning language, which does read a little bit differently than a typical book might, we've tried to indicate what those two scenarios are, kind of a if this, then that, or if this, then that. And instead of referring people to different cross sections and kind of creating this journey of discovery, if you will, the proposed amendments try to just go right to the point of clarifying, if this is your condition, you have a median park, we expect this type of a sidewalk and this type of a dooryard space, such that we get a good design solution for the building. Or if you have a park right next to the building, we're expecting this type of a sidewalk with this type of a dooryard. And we hope that spells a little bit more clarity and expectations for the few instances where we have a public park codified on these plans.
It does, thank you. Anyone else?
I mean, I would just like to note, I do like to read zoning language in my free time. You're all taking that as a joke.
I need to hang out with you more, obviously.
I'll be that person and say, I'm so happy with where this landed, this whole journey. I think we're in such a good place with this proposal. We had obviously questions about the cross sections and the advisory working group, but I think we're in a pretty good place, especially considering we're dealing with mature trees, we're dealing with historic preservation, we're dealing with new development, we're dealing with the fact that we did prioritize, preserving a lot of on-street parking, and we're trying to put in a bike facility, right? Lot going on there. I think we ended up in a pretty good place.
Good. That's good to hear. Those are all the questions that I had. I had a quick question on process, if anybody wanted to talk about process or anybody wanted to bring up. I noticed that we have listed for the county board in January to advertise. So does that come to the planning commission in January? I always get a little confused on this. Sometimes I feel like things come to the planning commission first, then we recommend it to the county board, then it goes to advertise, then it comes back to the planning commission. Is that the schedule here? And I didn't see the planning commission on the schedule.
So we typically don't take a request to advertise to the planning commission. We'll just take it to the planning commission the month that the board is hearing the item. And especially in this case, when we have an opportunity to take it to ZOCO or LRPC in other cases, that's kind of the first touch point before it goes to county board.
Okay, great. Thanks for clarifying that. Commissioner Striner stepped off, so thanks for attending. I'm running out of ideas here, so I think we're going to say any public speakers that we need to attend to.
Check the chat, Mr. Chair. No one has indicated in the meeting chat from our members of the public that they'd like to provide public comment.
Okay. Any last wrap-up thoughts then? Staff, did you guys get everything you needed? Are there any questions or any outstanding information that you would like to hear from us? Any support, any crits? No? We're good?
Good questions.
Yeah,
All
thank
right.
you.
Looking around the table, no one else?
Oh,
Let's
yeah,
go
that's
home.
right. That's right.
I'm hesitating to wrap up, but that's the end of the meeting. So thanks so much. Thank you all for coming. Sorry you couldn't make it in person, but we're happy to see you virtually. And thank you for all my planning commissioners that showed up. We had more than a quorum. All right, good night.
Thanks, folks. Thanks, Matt.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.